like to introduce Ted Powell. Ted spent the early part of his career as a Fellow and Director of Studies in History at Downing College, Cambridge. Later he qualified as a solicitor and spent many years as a partner of national law firm Wills and Reed. He's now a full-time writer and lecturer and lives in Cambridge. And Ted's here with us today because I met Ted on my writing course where he was writing his book on Edward VIII, so I thought it was a good idea to invite him here to talk to us. So welcome, Ted.
Thank you
very much.
Hello everyone. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes.
Good. Well, thank you very much for inviting me today. As Hefsey said, we've worked together for several years now on the biography group that we both attend. And I very much enjoyed hearing about Eugene's life and work over the last few years with Hefsey. And this has been my contribution to the biography group. And as you see, the sun's come out for a talk this afternoon. As you see, the title of my book is King Edward VIII, An American Life. And much of the book really is an examination of the rather sort of peculiar psychology of Edward VIII, later the Duke of Windsor. And it was really through his enthusiasm and love for America and all things American that I came to this insight, in a sense, into Edward and his personality. And if I can just read, by way of introduction, a short passage from one of my chapters. It's a sort of central chapter of the book, and it's called David Against Edward. In November 1931, a little girl called Daphne Digby Jones took part in the Halloween Ice Carnival, a charity event at Grosvenor House in London. The star guests were the Prince of Wales, our Edward, the future Edward VIII, and Charlie Chaplin. Daphne asked the Prince to autograph her programme, which he duly did, using his normal signature, Edward P., Edward the Prince. In response, she wagged her finger at it. "You know that is not your name," she said, referring to the fact that Edward was known within the royal family as David. Now, it was not unusual for a member of royalty to have a family name different from his official name. Edward's grandfather, King Edward VII, was always known in the family as Bertie, although his official style was Edward, Prince of Wales, before he became king. In the case of Edward/David, however, the duality came to symbolise a psychological divide which deepened as the prince grew older. Between 1914 and 1936, a personality split developed between the quintessentially British Edward, the Prince and later the King, and David, the increasingly Americanised private man. And that, in a sense, is the theme of my talk today. I just wonder, is it possible for somebody to get me a glass of water? I may need one in the course of the talk. That's very kind. Now, this is, of course, a paradoxical title, because how can a British king lead an American life? But that is, in essence, the theme of my story, that long before Edward had met Wallis Simpson, he had fallen in love with America and all things American. And the book is really a study of his lifelong love affair with America and all things American, and his ultimately doomed attempt to reconcile that love, that enthusiasm, with his destiny as the heir to the British throne. Could you perhaps go to the next slide? Now, of course, nowadays, Edward is perhaps best known from his appearance in the popular Netflix series The Crown, and played by the well-known actor Alex Jennings, who seemed to specialise in royal characters. And here they are, side by side, and you'll see actually that Alex Jennings is not a bad physical likeness for the older Edward when he was Duke of Windsor. But of course that series really sort of represents Edward as the wicked uncle and perpetuates the caricature of the shallow, pleasure-loving playboy who abandoned his duty and his throne to marry an American divorcee and then took up with Nazi sympathisers before and during the Second World War. Now obviously, like all caricatures, there's a strong element of truth in that, but it's a very two-dimensional characterisation in my view, and certainly doesn't tell the whole story about Edward and doesn't get us close to an understanding of his personality. Could we have the next slide? Here are some less familiar images, displaying, I think, that there is very much another side to Edward, the American side, and hinting at the profound impact that the USA has on Edward. And here he is, we see him in these less well-known photographs from the 1920s, both as a cowboy and as an Indian. Here he is on his Canadian ranch, or should I say ranch. He insisted upon calling it a ranch, suggesting it was a serious operation or not just a hobby. And here he is on the right as a big chief Morning Star, the chief of the Stoney Cree Indians in Canada, in full chief's regalia. Now, Edward's view of America can be summed up in a quote from his memoirs, which he published in the 1950s. He said then, "America meant to me a country where nothing was impossible. And by contrast, of course, Britain, the United Kingdom, was a place where many things were impossible for Edward, not least his ability to marry the woman that he loved." And obviously with Edward, one has to start, I think, with the abdication, something which all of us are familiar with. You'll remember that he abdicated the throne in December 1936, and there's that very famous radio broadcast that he made, and the central quote, "I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility as I would wish to do without the help and support of the woman I love." And of course, the woman he loved was Wallis Simpson. We see that familiar photograph there. And in the words of a very popular West Indian calypso of 1937, it was love, love alone that caused King Edward to leave the throne. But was it that simple? Many have argued that it's not. For some, the love affair was a pretext that Edward never wanted to be king, and he was looking for a way out of this terrible burden. Others have seen an establishment plot to get rid of Edward, that there were influential figures, including the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin, who thought that Edward was unsuitable to be king, that he had modernistic ideas, he intervened too much in politics, he had too many thoughts of his own, and that it was better to get rid of him. But for me, I see this as much more of a long-term issue, that the seeds of the abdication are really sown 15 to 20 years before, in Edward's first encounters with America. And there is an ongoing process of cultural Americanization taking place, in which the sympathy, the affinity with America develops, and increasingly Edward David is out of sympathy with his British heritage. And the abdication brings into sharp relief the peculiar nature of the status of the monarch, because he or she is both an individual and an institution, as we see represented here. Obviously, King Edward VIII in all his finery and regalia, his status, his garter robes and so on. And then David on holiday, stripped down just as a very ordinary man, the American David. Now, some monarchs do seem to cope with that dichotomy, that dilemma, reasonably well. And the sense I have, I don't know about you, is that our current Queen, Elizabeth, manages that dual role, that dual status pretty well, and is reasonably comfortable in her own skin. But Edward VIII was never comfortable with that dual role, to such an extent, as I've suggested, that in the course of the period between 1914 and 1936, he evolves these two distinct personas. There's the smiling prince, Prince Edward, the embodiment of the establishment, the representation of Britishness on the one hand, and then David, the private man, very shy, very lacking in confidence, a strong sense of unworthiness for the role that he's heir to, and also a figure who is, as I've said, very deeply drawn towards America and all things American. And it's very interesting when you read Edward's letters that he talks, particularly when he's Prince of Wales in the 20s and 30s, he talks of the Prince of Wales in the third person, as if he is somebody else. There is David, private man, and then there is Edward, this role that he has to play, who is actually a sort of a different persona. And he, for example, when he's on tour, he says that the first day that he's in a city, the people are cheering for the Prince of Wales, not for me. And then on the second or third day, they've got to know him as an individual, and therefore they're responding more directly to David, to him. So it's a very interesting dichotomy there. Next slide, please. And all that Edward wanted, in a sense, and something he was always denied, was to be an ordinary individual, an ordinary person. And he said in his memoirs, it's on the very last page of his memoirs, interestingly, I was obsessed with the desire to be found worthy and to share in the risks and struggles of men. And I think this photograph rather sort of captures that very nicely. It's one of my favourite images of Edward, taken in around about 1924, when he would have been 30 years old. And you do get that sense of the sort of the cares of the world on his shoulders. Although it could be, of course, that he's just suffering from a terrible hangover. But for much of his life, in a sense, he's always trying to escape, trying to get away from the burden of being Edward. Next slide, please. Edward was born in 1894. And therefore he was 20 years old in 1914. So he's exactly the right age, or the wrong age, depending on how you look at it, for military service in the First World War. In order to understand him, you have to understand that the First World War is the defining experience of his life. He volunteers immediately for military service. He joins the Grenadier Guards. But, of course, as Prince of Wales and heir to the throne, he's not allowed in the front line. He's not allowed the direct combat. And for him, that is something which is deeply humiliating. As we've seen, he wants to share in the risks and struggles of men. He wants to be found worthy. But that is something that he is denied in the greatest test of his generation, or indeed of any generation. And that's a very deeply humiliating experience for him. But secondly, on a more positive note, for the first time during the war, he encounters Americans in large number, of course, with the arrival of US troops in northern France, in Britain and in France, at the beginning of 1918, and then building up in large numbers. Now, of course, the military impact of the Americans, although not negligible, was relatively slight in the First World War. As I've said, they were only really arriving in numbers right at the very end of the war. But the psychological impact of the arrival of the Americans was absolutely enormous. Next slide, please. And here are just a couple of examples of that. The first comes from the memoir of Vera Brittain, that poignant memoir of the generation that fought the war, Vera Brittain's Testament of Youth. This is written in early 1918, the spring of 1918. I pressed forward to watch the United States physically entering the war. So godlike, so magnificent. My eyeballs pricked, my throat ached. With the knowledge that we were not after all defeated, I found myself beginning to cry. And that illustrates the degree of the impact that with all that weight of the American economy and the American army on the side of the Allies, they knew that they would not now be defeated. Now, of course, Edward was nothing like as eloquent or as great a writer as Vera Brittain, but he's saying very much the same sort of thing in his letters home. I'm liking the Americans more than ever. I'm just longing to go to the States, but we must be closely allied to them, closer than we are now, and they are very keen about it. Edward, of course, he's in the last months of 1918, early 1919. He's spending a lot of his time in an ambassadorial role, visiting American troops, visiting Canadian troops and others from the Empire and the Commonwealth. Next slide, please. Well, what is very interesting at this time is that although he's not a well-educated man, he's not a particularly bright man, he's not particularly intelligent, but he has this very powerful intuition at the end of 1918 and the beginning of 1919 that this is a critical turning point in history. This is the beginning of the American century at the end of 1918, beginning of 1919. And it may be, of course, in passing that we are just seeing the end of the American century with the withdrawal of America under President Trump from its sort of globally responsible role, but who knows? It's worth remembering that at the end of the war, Britain owes the USA, owes the bankers of the USA, $4.3 billion, and that's in 1918 money. You think how much that was. Now that was an enormous sum, and it was ultimately never fully repaid, but it was a huge debt hanging over the British economy. And of course at that time, President Woodrow Wilson bestrides the world diplomatically because of American economic power. And his 14 points for a new peaceful world order based on democracy and self-determination really set the agenda for the Paris Peace Conference, Versailles Peace Conference. And he's the first sitting president to actually come over to Europe. He visits Britain at the end of 1918. And he stays at Buckingham Palace with King George V and Queen Mary. And King George even gives up his precious Christmas holidays at Sandringham to entertain the president. And he's greeted like a conquering hero in Britain. Now, Woodrow Wilson, of course, returns the invitation. He invites King George and Queen Mary to visit him in America, in the White House. But, of course, King George hates America. He regards the USA, if you like, as a sort of colony gone wrong, an upstart, brash nation, vulgar, and worst of all, sort of threatening to usurp Britain's supremacy in the world. So instead, he sends his son, Prince of Wales, Prince Charming. And Edward pays 2 visits to America in quick succession in 1919 and 1920. The first is at the end of his tour of Canada in the autumn of 1919, and the second is when he's on his way to Australia the following year. So in 1919, he visits Washington, D.C., he pays a courtesy call on Woodrow Wilson, and he also visits New York. And he has the extraordinary excitement of a ticker tape parade in Manhattan in the autumn of 1919. Let's see if I can just find a brief quote there. This is based on Edward's own memoir of the occasion. As the limousine drove up Broadway's Canyon of Heroes through the business district, a blizzard of ticker tape descended upon the prince. Stung by the spectacle, the noise, and the stench of petrol fumes, he gaped up in wonder at the 55-story Woolworth building, then the tallest in the world. The cacophony was indescribable. The masses of spectators lining the route fought with police to get a better view of the passing parade. After a few moments, the prince collected himself. He stood up in the back of the car, smiling, bowing, and waving to the crowds. It was an acclamation thrilling beyond description, as he later wrote. So that was his ticker tape parade. The following year, he sailed through the Panama Canal, newly opened Panama Canal. He stopped off in the Canal Zone and also at San Diego and in Hawaii. While he was in Panama, he danced the night away with an American shop girl, caused a bit of a sensation by ignoring the wives of the dignitaries, the president and the governor of the Canal Zone, and dancing with this beautiful shop girl. In Hawaii, he tries surfing for the first time. That is I think the very first example of a Briton experiencing the delights of surfing. And he's so taken with the Wild West that he buys a ranch, I should say, in Alberta. Of course, being the heir to the throne, he had to buy a property in Canada rather than America, but nonetheless, he was still sort of thrilled with the open life of the prairie. And that, of course, causes quite a stir. The fact that the Prince of Wales has bought property in well, it's a dominion, of course, rather than a colony. And of course, the Canadians are absolutely delighted that Edward has actually got his cattle ranch there. So it becomes quite a talking point. And indeed, a very large-scale sculpture of Edward at his ranch, the EP Ranch as it was called, was made for the British Empire exhibition in 1924. That was at Wembley. Some of you may have heard of that. And the sculpture was made out of 2.5 tons of Canadian butter. So it was 50 foot long and 10 feet tall. And there it is. So it's extremely expertly carved in Canadian butter. And that's the sculpture there. And that was one of the highlights of the exhibition. And just to prove to you that I'm not making it up, here is a photograph of Edward surfing in Hawaii. Actually, you can see his signature here. He was very proud of the fact that he actually, as you see, managed to stand up on his surfboard and surf what's it called, surf the rip curl, as they say, on his way into Waikiki Beach. And he was particularly pleased because, I don't know if you can see, there's a little head just popping out of the water there, and that is the head of Lord Louis Mountbatten, the future Earl Mountbatten of Burma, who was accompanying Edward on his trip. And he, of course, had fallen off his surfboard. And Edward was particularly pleased that while he managed to stay up, Mountbatten couldn't keep on his surfboard and kept falling into the water. So he was very happy and proud of that photograph. And of course, all these events, all these activities give Edward a very high profile in America. For example, the story of his dalliance, the sort of Cinderella evening with an American shop girl, made front page news across America, though it was not reported at all in Britain at the time. And obviously these images of Edward surfing in Hawaii were also extremely popular. So he's very much recognised in America as a celebrity in his own right, and the world's most eligible bachelor at that time, the heartbreaker of the world. To the extent, in fact, that the Daily Express, on its front page, in one of its articles, advocated that in view of the sort of growing Anglo-American alliance, that the prince should marry an American lady. Next slide, please. So those were the first two visits that Edward made to America in 1919 and 1920. They had a huge impact upon him, and he's very keen to go back and visit America again. And the next time he manages to get there is in 1924, of course at the height of the Roaring Twenties. It's the Jazz Age, and Edward is on his way to his Canadian ranch and stops off for a holiday in the USA first, in Long Island, ostensibly to view the international polo series of matches between Britain and the USA. But really it's an excuse for some very serious partying on Long Island. Of course, all the super rich of New York and the East Coast are sort of competing to get Edward to come to their parties. And it's really, I mean, it's one long party holiday for him. So maybe he'll sort of start at about 10 o'clock at night and go through, the whole evening, 4 or 5 parties, and getting home at about 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock in the morning. And that generated saturation press coverage in America with headlines such as "Prince gets in with the milkman." So obviously the idea being that the milkman is delivering just as Edward is getting home. And of course, perhaps inevitably, he has a brief but passionate holiday romance with a Hollywood starlet, a long-forgotten figure called Pinner Nesbit Kruger, who was reasonably well known at the time. She was married, of course, at that point. And one striking thing is if you see photographs of Pinner from the time, she does bear quite a strong resemblance to Wallis Simpson. So it's very much a sort of Gatsby moment, if you like. And one can imagine Edward sort of cruising in and out of a party given by the great Gatsby, as described by Scott Fitzgerald. And interestingly, not Scott, but Zelda Fitzgerald actually wrote a short story, clearly based on Edward, called "The Girl the Prince Liked," and it was a very brief story about a wealthy heiress who has an affair with a prince from England. Anyway, Edward has this marvellous time in America. Next slide, please. He's very keen to return. He plans a return trip in 1926 to visit some of the industrial cities of the Midwest. But he receives a very cold reception on his return from America in 1924. His father, King George, has been reading the mountain of American newspaper headlines, and he is appalled at the coverage that Edward received. He regards it as most undignified and, on the part of the American press, unwarrantedly intrusive into Edward's private life. And in effect, not in so many words, but in effect, he bans Edward from returning to America. So whenever he sort of tentatively puts forward a plan to go and visit the States, there's always some reason why it's not possible. So, if Edward can't go to America, America comes to Edward. And of course, this is the 1920s, so we are seeing in Britain the first great wave of American cultural influence. Obviously, with jazz and the new dance crazes like the Charleston and the Black Bottom, Hollywood movies, needless to say, so important, and the flood of American consumer goods and American words, American slang, jazz, Hoover, radio, all those familiar American things. And that's very much the sort of theme of the Roaring Twenties. And that points up and illustrates, I think, the generational divide between Edward and his father. For King George, everything American is vulgar, is unwelcome, is novel, is trashy. For Edward, it's the world that he inhabits. It's exciting, it's new, it's the wave of the future, and he is profoundly comfortable with it. And of course, the sort of symbolization of the symbol of that, is jazz. Next slide, please. And in fact, one of Edward's favourite slang expressions is jazzing around, which sort of means not doing anything much or just messing about. And he is, of course, a huge fan of American jazz. He imports the latest records from New York. He sponsors one of the first major tours of a jazz band, that's to say the tour of Paul Whiteman's orchestra in the mid-20s. Paul Whiteman, he's a white musician, but he is one of the first to popularise jazz to wider audiences. Edward visits Paris very frequently because that is one of the great hubs of jazz in Europe. Clubs like Kylie's and Bricktops become very famous, and they're patronised by the Prince of Wales. And gradually, as you get the authentic jazz emerging with stars like Duke Ellington and Louis Armstrong, they're actually coming over and touring in Britain, and Edward is attending their concerts. And of course, in those days, some of these musicians would actually play at private parties. And there's a wonderful account of Edward at a party, I think given by Lord Beaverbrook, the newspaper magnate, where Ellington's band was playing. And it's from the memoirs of Ellington's drummer, who's a chap called Sonny Greer, of course a black musician, needless to say. And this is what Sonny Greer recalled in his memoirs. He said he noticed a skinny little guy, this is Edward, a skinny little guy squatting near the drums. Edward by this point is about 35, 38. Pretty soon, I can't do an American accent, but I'll just read it straight. Pretty soon, he asks, can we play the Charleston? We did, and he danced like crazy. Then he asked me, could he sit in the drums? And I said, of course, my man. People kept on coming up and calling him Your Highness or Wales, but he wouldn't move. We both began to get high on whatever it was we were drinking. He was calling me Sonny, and I was calling him the Whale. And very revealing, I think, about Edward, that it's this opposite of the sort of formality and pageantry of royalty. He just wants to be sort of, in with the guys, just sort of being part of the band, playing the drums, just having fun. Next slide. But I think it's important to emphasise that the Americanization of Edward goes more than just skin deep. I mean, it's not just a question of his liking for jazz and Hollywood movies and so on. It's a deep-rooted personal and cultural affinity with the USA. And in the later 20s and 30s, he surrounds himself with American friends, he buys American cars, he adopts American slang expressions, he chews American gum, and of course he takes American lovers. We've heard about Pinner Kruger, his holiday romance in 1924, and his first more serious mistress was of course Thelma Furness, the American wife of a British shipping magnate. And there they are together at the theatre in the early 1930s. And as you can see, Thelma was a very, very beautiful young woman. She was in fact the twin sister of Gloria Vanderbilt, the famous wife of a Vanderbilt heiress. And Thelma sort of took some of the blame for Americanizing Edward in the late 20s and 30s. But to my mind, she's much more, the relationship is much more a symptom of Edward's Americanization than a cause. And if Edward adores America, then that sentiment is reciprocated. America adores Edward. Next slide. And he's one of the leading American celebrities of the age in the interwar period in the 1920s and 30s. So if he's royalty in Britain, of course, but in America, he's a celebrity. So he's on a par with a Hollywood star, like Clark Gable or Douglas Fairbanks or Charlie Chaplin or whoever. And he receives fan mail. He's pursued by the forerunners of the paparazzi for photographs and news when he's in America. And he has this reputation as the heartbreaker of the world, the world's most eligible bachelor. And this rather wonderful cartoon here at the bottom, I don't know if you can see it. It's by a Mexican-American cartoonist called Miguel Covarrubias. And it shows Edward, I think you can see this rather pale, drooping figure on the right, shaking hands with a very macho, masculine cubist figure. And I just wonder if anybody can speculate who that is a cartoon of, the figure on the left. Can anybody guess who it might be? Any suggestions?
Looks loosely like Clark Gable.
It is Clark Gable. Well done. That's great. That's the first. You're the first person who's ever got that right. It is indeed Clark Gable, and it was, of course, this was in 1932. It's from an article in Vanity Fair, the American Vanity Fair, and it's part of a series called Impossible Interviews, where two sort of contrasting figures are brought together in fantasy. And in this one, Edward is conceding his title as Heartbreaker of the World to the new Hollywood star, Clark Gable. Next slide. But I should also add that there's a more serious side to Edward's American enthusiasms, and in particular with the very strong ties that Edward develops with American business, because he very much sees that the way forward for British industry, which is of course struggling at this time with the Depression and very high unemployment and so on, that the way forward is to adopt American business methods. And here he is, for example, in Detroit with Henry Ford. It's Henry Ford on the right and the Edsel Ford, the son, on the left. And Edward has very good connections, not just with Ford, but also with Charles Dawes, the architect of the Dawes Plan for the economic reconstruction of Germany after the war, the banker, Andrew Mellon, the founder of Kodak, George Eastman, and many others. So there is an important link there, in a sense, between the prince and some of the titans of American business, which Edward was seeking to develop in order to improve the prospects of British industry and the British economy. Okay, so let us just move on perhaps to more familiar ground now, and to meet Wallis Simpson, the lady that Edward ultimately fell in love with and married. Now, Edward's mistress, Thelma Furness, was beginning to tire of Edward in the early 1930s. She was, as it were, the sort of formal mistress. But Edward was a very demanding figure, emotionally very needy, very self-centered, of course, and it has to be said, not the most exciting company. And Thelma is extremely beautiful, she's very rich, she has lots of suitors, and she is sort of seeking really to, find people to entertain Edward, to keep him amused. And she meets Wallis and Ernest Simpson, who are effectively American expatriates in London, and she invites them to weekends with the Prince at his retreat at Fort Belvedere. And then Thelma, in early 1934, takes a holiday, goes on vacation to the USA to visit her twin sister, And on the way, on the boat, she has an affair with another prince, the Prince Ali Khan, who is the son of the Aga Khan, and of course, for him, this is a great sort of trophy affair with the mistress of the Prince of Wales. Before she goes, she says to Wallis, do look after the prince while I'm away. And Wallis famously says to Thelma, darling, the little man will be so lonely. And Wallis made it her business to ensure, of course, that Edward was not lonely. And by the time that Thelma returned, Edward's affections had been transferred to Wallis. So who was Wallis Simpson? Best understood, I think, as a Southern belle from Baltimore. And her grandfather was on the Confederate side in the war. He was imprisoned, in fact, by the Union for refusing to take the oath of loyalty to the United States. By the time she meets Edward, Wallis is 37, and she's twice married. And in a way, she's a bit like a 20th century Scarlett OConnor. She's charming, feisty, hardened by adversity, and forced to rely on her own charm and personality to get on. And it may just be a coincidence, but the Gone with the Wind, the famous book by Margaret Mitchell, was published in 1936, and Wallis Simpson, with her affair with Edward, comes to worldwide fame at almost exactly the same time. And contemporaries did make the comparison, the parallel between Wallis on one hand and Scarlett OConnor on the other. So what is it about Wallis that Edward finds so attractive? And I was very struck by the opening lines of Gone with the Wind. Scarlett OConnor was not beautiful, but men seldom realised it when caught by her charm. And I think that tells us quite a bit about Wallis as well, that she clearly was a very charming and engaging woman. And of course for Edward, her American forthrightness and lack of deference were very attractive, because of course he's surrounded by sycophants. All the British women that he meets are sort of almost speechless with awe when in his presence. Not so Wallis. She speaks her mind. She's very sort of independent-minded, prepared to say what she thinks. There is this assumption that she had some sort of special sexual hold over Edward, that she enslaved him with certain exotic sexual practices. I'm sort of sceptical about that. I think much more important than that was the emotional connection that Wallis managed to establish with Edward. That she perceived his acute emotional isolation as a royal prince. And she managed, by persistence and tact, to break through that isolation and to get to the individual underneath. And perhaps the consequences were far more dramatic than she could ever have conceived. And that takes us, of course, to the Abdication Crisis of 1936. This is well known, I'm sure, a familiar story to you. Edward became king in January 1936 on the death of his father, King George V. Pretty much from the start, he's determined to marry Wallis, although he keeps it as quiet as he possibly can. And during this period, right up until the last moment in December, the UK press, astonishingly by modern standards, the UK press is totally silent about Edward's relationship with Wallis. Although it's well known within London society, it's a sort of open secret, but the vast majority of the population knows nothing about it. By contrast, and this is very, very striking, if you read the American newspapers, they are, from the middle of the year, they are full of the romance between Edward and Wallis, and of course the excitement of his relationship with American women, an American woman, really gets to the enthusiasm of the American public. So that there is, daily coverage of their relationship. And of course, when Wallis seeks her divorce in October of 1936, there is blanket, wall-to-wall coverage of the divorce in America, and still, astonishingly, virtually no reporting of it in Britain. Now, traditionally, the abdication has been seen as a fierce little domestic crisis in Britain, but in fact, it is triggered by events in America, because what is happening is that expatriates in the States are seeing all this material about the relationship between Edward and Wallis, and they are writing home, and they're writing to the Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin, to the Archbishop of Canterbury, to the King's private secretary, and they're saying, what on earth is going on? The good name of Britain is being sort of dragged in the dust, the monarchy is a laughing stock. We must make sort of firm denials of these scurrilous rumours. And for many weeks, Stanley Baldwin, the Prime Minister, does his best to ignore it. He cannot conceive that Edward is actually serious in his wish to marry Wallis Simpson. And it's only when the divorce hearing actually takes place that the alarm bells start ringing in Britain. And it's in fact the editor of the Times, Geoffrey Dawson, who receives a particularly strong letter from America, and he sends that to the Prime Minister and also to Hardinge, the King's private secretary, and says something must be done. And that precipitates the crisis. Stanley Baldwin, the Prime Minister, goes to see the King, and the King finally comes clean and says, yes, I'm determined to marry Wallis, and I will abdicate if necessary in order to do so. And that, of course, was what happened. There was no turning back from that point, and he leaves the throne. Sorry. So, after the abdication for Edward and Wallis, there is this sort of massive anticlimax, if you like. And for poor Wallis, the fairy tale operates in reverse, because she kisses a prince and he turns into a frog. And the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, as they become, are ostracised by Buckingham Palace. They are completely cut off immediately after the abdication. And what is particularly important and significant for Edward's career after the abdication is that he immediately loses all his advisors and staff, all the private secretaries, the equerries, even his chauffeur and his valet and everybody. They all go. And to understand the significance of that, you have to realise that all royal figures are surrounded by a staff who manage their entire life for them. Everything they do, or the trips they go on, the speeches they make, they're all prepared by the staff. And Edward was no exception. He'd been managed like that for his entire life, and he's completely at sea. And of course the result is that he ends up taking advice from the most unsuitable people, often for their own private ends. And that is why he ends up in 1937 going on a tour to Nazi Germany, which is organised by a French-American businessman called Charles Badeau, who wants to improve his business activities in Germany. Now that, of course, is a fiasco. It's a public relations disaster for Edward, and a subsequent tour of the USA, which he was hoping to go on after his tour of Germany, was cancelled at the last minute. And of course, Edward's reputation never really recovers from his meeting with Hitler in 1937 and his subsequent sympathies, apparent sympathies with Germany. And we can talk a bit about that in the discussion afterwards, if you like. But just to put that in a bit of perspective from Edward's point of view, we of course assess Germany under the Nazis from the perspective of the Second World War and the Holocaust. Edward and his generation, many of his generation, looked at Hitler and the Nazis from the perspective of the First World War and the appalling carnage and loss of life that took place in that war. And for Edward, and I think for many others of the so-called appeasers in the 1930s, anything was better than another war with Germany. So I just wanted to sort of give you that perspective to think about. Anyway, moving on to the Second World War, as you may know, he becomes the governor of the Bahamas in the years 1940 to 45. At that point, he's very much a non-person in Britain. He remains a pariah, and the fact that he's gone to the Bahamas, of course, is partly because Churchill, the Prime Minister, wants to put him in a sort of the most obscure, least important place he can possibly find to get him out of the way. But for Edward, conveniently, it's close to America, where his reputation is still quite high. It hasn't been affected by the abdication. Indeed, in a way, there is a great deal of sympathy for Edward and Wallis. Wallis being, of course, an American citizen, in the sense that they have been unfairly treated because of Wallis's American status. And President Roosevelt, in particular, is very intrigued by Edward, and he enjoys meeting him. Roosevelt, being, of course, having overcome massive odds in order to become President of the United States, cannot understand why Edward should voluntarily have given up the throne of Britain just for love, so to speak. And actually, during the war, Edward visits America again. He has a triumphant tour with Wallis in 1941, and once he has taken on the role of governor of the Bahamas, and Churchill has sort of read him the Riot Act, if you like, about making sort of defeatist comments about Germany. He spent a lot of time in the USA during the war, campaigning and encouraging America to enter the war and also to support Britain in the war effort. For example, in 1941, before America is in the war, he actually goes to Detroit to talk to Henry Ford, a notorious isolationist at the time, to encourage him to make supplies for the British war effort. After the war, as we just wrap up, next slide, please. Yeah. After the war, there is no role for Edward. He was keen to continue in some form of public service for Britain, possibly in a diplomatic role, which would have enabled him to live in the United States. But there was nothing for him. The royal family, Buckingham Palace, was still having nothing to do with him. So in effect, the years from 1945 to his death in 1972 are years of gilded uselessness. The couple drift from Paris to New York, to the Riviera, in a rather sort of aimless existence, pursuing sporting pastimes. Edward spent most of his time shooting and playing golf, and here, of course, you can see how much Wallis is enjoying sharing those activities with him. Not really an outdoor girl, Wallis. Though they have no role, they're sort of quite celebrated figures on the jet set, the wealthy circuit. They remain style icons in the glossy magazines, and they do remain very, very wealthy. And they do continue to make frequent visits to America. And we might just finish on this rather intriguing note that Edward's last visit to America in 1970 included a dinner at the White House with President Nixon, a dinner given very much in his honour. They were quite good friends, and here we see Nixon with the Windsors, and really a most intriguing encounter between the only president voluntarily to resign the throne of the United States and the only king voluntarily to abdicate the throne of Great Britain. Thank you very much.